Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis with the Daily Beast. He's their senior columnist.
Friend of mine and friend of America.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for rating and reviewing us on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, wherever you get podcasts. And thank you for supporting long-form conversations like this one on Patreon, patreon.com/Matt Lewis. We have a great guest today, his second time on the show. It's Thomas Ricks. He's the author. Well, he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of some really amazing books, including the new one, which is already a New York Times bestseller. It's called First Principles: What America's Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans and How That Shaped Our Country. Tom Ricks, welcome back to the news.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
I love this book, and this is like one of the books I wish that I had thought of or had the ability to write. Because I know that the impetus for writing this book was sort of like what happened in 2016. A lot of us had that same question. Not all of us were able to write a book like this. But talk about that morning and the decision to explore this idea.
Sure. You don't always know where a book comes from, but this one I can tell you exactly when and where. I was in the house I'm in now on an island off the coast of Maine, built in 1812. And I woke up that gray Wednesday morning after the presidential election, and I thought to myself, what just happened here? I don't understand that the election of Donald Trump. I don't understand what people think they're doing by electing him. And I don't think he understands the Constitution of the country we live in. So with those questions in mind, I ambled downstairs to my library, and I pulled down my old copy of Aristotle's Politics. And I did this because when you have a basic question, a basic problem, something you don't understand, it's good to go back to fundamentals, to the basics, to first principles. And I reread Aristotle's Politics in the context of Donald Trump becoming president. One thing that really struck me in that reading that day was Aristotle says that oligarchy, the rule by the rich, is the least formal, let me back up, please, the least stable form of government. And that intrigued me. And I said, what else you got, Aristotle? And I read some other stuff, and that took me into other Greek history and politics, and then to Roman history and politics and philosophy. And then I was intrigued that I kept seeing references to how the American revolutionary generation had been so influenced by ancient Rome and to a lesser extent by ancient Greece. And I read a lot of that, and I read about the Enlightenment. And I wound up writing this book that kind of explores how the ancient world, and especially the decline of the Roman Republic, shaped the views of the people who designed this country.
And I want to talk a lot about the history because I love it, and I love talking about the founders. But I do want to cut to the chase. I mean, it strikes me that Donald Trump is exactly the kind of person that the founders feared based on what they learned from history.
Well, they've seen a lot of bad of human nature during the revolution, and they had seen scoundrels and rogues and traitors, and they knew they had to write a constitution that would somehow be able to survive people like that. As Thomas Jefferson said, bad men will sometimes get into office. And as his friend James Madison said, if men were angels, we wouldn't need a government. So they wrote the Constitution very much the notion that you have to get through bad times as well as good times. You're going to have times when rogues hold power. So what do you do about it? And the fundamental answer they came up with, which is James Madison's answer, is we are going to disperse power so broadly across this country that no one person can impose their will on everybody else. So you have this real dispersion of power between states and the federal government, between the three branches of the federal government, executive, legislative, and judicial. And within the legislative branch, you have two different houses of government. I was thinking about this just this week, something I'd never thought about in my life, which is, isn't it interesting that the federal government doesn't run federal elections? You'd think that would make sense. Instead, state governments run the elections for the federal government. Think how different this historical moment would be if Donald Trump on his own could say, I'm the chief of the executive branch and I decertify this presidential election. He can't. He has no power over certifying this election. I gotta say, thank you, James Madison and your comrades, in coming up with that solution.
See, great minds think alike, because I made that point on CNN this week. And I think it is so true that you know, we are blessed. I mean, and I know there's a lot of criticism about things like the Electoral College and all that, and gridlock, but the founders, pit ambition against ambition, and they created this, this system that it's dinged up, I have to admit, but it did withstand the last 4 years.
It turns out it's a very resilient system. And James Madison would say, by the way, gridlock, that's not a bug, that's a feature. Power is dispersed so broadly that if you can't make alliances, cut deals, arrive at compromises, you're not going to get anywhere. You've got to have, especially a big republic, and he was worried about, is a big republic sustainable? Can it live? You've got to have this wide dispersal of power that forces people to somehow engage in some wrangling to come out with any progress at all.
Right. Now, you mentioned Montesquieu, who was a French philosopher, but he learned from antiquity, from the classical period. He believed, as you just noted, that big republics couldn't endure. What was that based on? And did the founders, did that cause them to take any steps?
Quite a lot. Back up here, the founders looking around when they're sort of trying to figure out, okay, this Articles of Confederation contraption we had in the 1780s, that's not working. So we're going to have to make a new design. And they look around and they want a government of the people, where there's not a whole lot of examples to look for. Most governments, most of the time in history, have been run by kings or emperors or tribal chiefs or something. And there's precious few examples. One is the Roman Republic. And the two lessons they took away from the Roman Republic were that it was brought down by factionalism and by corruption. Montesquieu himself, deeply devoted to writing about Roman history, he writes a whole book on the decline, and then his masterwork, The Spirit of Laws, is probably 1/3 of it is about Roman history. Montesquieu adds two more problems. As you said, Montesquieu says only city-states, small republics last. And the second is, he says the republics are generally not sustainable. So Madison and his peers, writing the Constitution, sitting around on these hot afternoons in Philadelphia, are trying to figure out, how do we deal with factionalism? How do we deal with corruption? How do we make a sustainable republic? And how do we handle a big republic? And dispersal of power, dividing it across the country in different branches of government. That is their first solution. And second is, as you said, pitting ambition against ambition. We can't get by on people's selflessness alone. You can't count on people to do the right thing. So instead, pit ambition against ambition and let people fight it out. They expected a fairly contentious system of government, and we got it.
I know when the founders, crafted these compromises, the small states weren't, the difference between small states and big states weren't, in terms of population, weren't as great as they are today. Right now, North Dakota has two senators and just a fraction of the population of, say, like New York or California. But with that caveat, there are a lot of people out there who think the Electoral College is a horrible idea, and it's obviously undemocratic. They want to get rid of it. It sounds like you might actually, looking back to the founders and back to antiquity, you might be more inclined to say, well, let's hold on a second. Maybe there's an argument for this.
Well, there's two aspects of this, and you're absolutely right. I wouldn't say absolutely get rid of the Electoral College. I would say, first of all, there are a lot of things in the Constitution that are shock absorbers, and the Electoral College is one of them. Be careful before you get rid of something, but also we might ask, is there a way to tinker with the Electoral College? Could we improve it? Remember, they designed the entire Constitution to be improved. these, when you make a change to it, it's not called a change, it's called an amendment, to amend it, to make it better. One thing you could do that would immediately change the Electoral College is say, that's right, when they designed the country, Virginia, the biggest state, was 12 times the population of Delaware, the smallest state. Now California is 25 times, or 50 times actually, the size of Wyoming. So let's give the big states 3 senators, the middle third, 2 senators, and the smallest states, 1 senator. That would immediately make it more democratic without getting rid of the Electoral College. But what I like is once you get into this sort of mindset of realizing, they were sitting around making this up, and then they went out for a beer on these hot evenings in Philadelphia. It's easier to tinker with it when you realize they kind of made it up. So one discussion they had one day was, should the presidency be 1 person, 2 people, or 3 people? And they pretty quickly said, when the Romans had 3 people, that didn't work out real well. So they made it 1 person. Another question they confronted was, who should impeach the president? They knew they wanted to have a limit on executive power. So who should impeach the president? Should it be the Supreme Court or should it be the Congress? Ultimately, they decide the Congress. But this opens up things like, okay, maybe the Supreme Court should simply have 18-year terms. I know that's been discussed in a recent academic study as a possible solution. I think we should be much more open to amending the Constitution than we have been. And I think the founders would kind of fault us on this. In the first century of the American Republic, the Constitution was amended frequently. In the last centuries, not so much, and nothing really major. And it may be time for us to have a constitutional convention to revisit some of these issues.
One thing, it's an obvious point about the book, but just it's stunning how much the founders really did look to Greece and Rome. And you point out, the word Democrat is Greek, the word Republican, the very parties, Republican is Latin. Some famous American slogans or quotes, "Give me liberty or give me death," and I regret I have only one life to give for my country," are really, examples of American patriots quoting, from the classical period. And, it strikes me that the entire, the founders, their vocabulary and their worldview was so shaped by this, the way that, I don't know if you've noticed, but anytime we start talking about Donald Trump and criticizing him, the only thing we could talk about is Hitler. Right now he's in the bunker, right? Everything we talk about as modern Americans, if we're talking about Hitler. And I feel like maybe for the founders, it was, they were talking about Caesar. Is that a good analogy?
It is very much, because this was their political vocabulary. Remember, they didn't have sports stars. They didn't have other heroes. Basically, their celebrity culture almost was Roman culture. And so they look to Rome not just for historical evidence and examples, they really look for role models. And what's interesting to me is they pick different ones. For George Washington, as a young man, it's very much Cato being the Roman statesman who opposed the rise of Julius Caesar, who ultimately commits suicide rather than surrender to Caesar. And it is known for his characteristics, kind of stoicism, a frugality, a reserve, a prudence, and a wisdom to him that George Washington, struggling to contain a volcanic temper as a young man, tries to emulate. And that's his first great role model. By contrast, John Adams tries to become like Cicero, another Roman politician known as a great orator. And interestingly, Plutarch, they all read Plutarch's Lives. Plutarch says that Cicero was a great patriot, but also incredibly vain. And John Adams managed to emulate both the good and the bad with Cicero.
And I know, early on in our discussion, it struck me that you're talking a lot about Madison and the Constitution and pitting ambition against ambition and gridlock. But Madison's someone that almost didn't make the cut, or at least initially you didn't think of Madison. Talk about the decision to include him.
Well, one of the things I've learned in life is talk to smart people before you start a big project. So as I was contemplating this book, I drove down to Providence, Rhode Island, and had lunch with a great American historian, Gordon Wood. And I said, here are the people I'm thinking of writing about, here's the themes and so on. And he instantly said, drop Benjamin Franklin, add Madison. And Gordon Wood actually, in addition to writing several good books, wrote a very good article in the New York Review of Books that I went and read about Madison. And he makes the argument that Madison is the second most important person in the founding of the country after George Washington. George Washington wins the war that gives us the country. But James Madison then is the man who gives us the design of the country we now live in 250 years later. There's also a saying among American historians that the more you know about George Washington, the more you admire him. And I think the same is true of James Madison. I really came to be fond of Madison. I think they called him Little Jimmy Madison. He was about 5'1", maybe 110 pounds, kind of sickly, suffered from some form of epilepsy. We're not quite sure what it was, and did not have a good speaking voice, and not a particularly great writer. There's not a whole lot of phrases we remember from Madison. Yet, through his intellect and his willpower, Madison shapes this country. He decides during the Articles of Confederation period that this thing isn't working. A lot of people agree with him, including George Washington. He starts beating the drum for holding a constitutional convention. He spends years doing research for the Constitutional Convention, really approaching the ancient world as a political scientist, looking at how Greek city-states worked, how their confederations worked, how the republic worked. What do you want to copy from that? What do you want to avoid? Then he goes off to Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, first guy to arrive for the convention, gives one of the first big speeches that lays out his thinking and what he's learned, very respected for the classical examples he provides. Then he and Alexander Hamilton, after the convention, lead the campaign to ratify the thing. Each state had a meeting to vote on the Constitution, and they lead this campaign for that. And then on top of it, in the 1790s, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson basically invent the first form of American politics. They say, we're going to have basically some sort of opposition here. They start up political newspapers, and they drive John Adams nuts when John Adams is president, because these newspapers criticize the president. And John Adams, drawing on Roman history, says, well, that's factionalism to criticize the leader. This is like treason. And so he starts throwing newspaper editors in jail. He has a disastrous presidency. He is voted out after one term. He becomes our first one-term president. He's pretty angry and bitter about it. He doesn't show up at the inauguration of his successor, Thomas Jefferson, and I think there's a good chance Donald Trump won't show up at the inauguration of his successor. Nonetheless, John Adams did turn over power to the opposition. And there's a saying among political scientists that anybody can hold an election and elect a president. The test of a democracy is whether the opposition can win an election and have power turned over to them. And John Adams, to his credit, does turn power over to Thomas Jefferson, the first transfer to the opposition in American history, and one that I wish Donald Trump understood better.
Yeah, look, I think you could argue that for all the good these men did, that the greatest thing George Washington did was stepping down after, as general, and then also stepping down after 2 terms as president. And then John Adams, granted, he sort of snuck out in the middle of the night, not the most gracious way of leaving the White House, but he left. And you could argue that really the most important thing he did was leave when he lost. And we should be grateful for that.
Totally. I have a lot of problems with John Adams. I think he's had an inflated reputation in recent years because of the rosy David McCullough biography, and then that HBO miniseries, which was fun, but has Paul Giamatti play John Adams as kind of this teddy bear. He was not a teddy bear. The thing that you're pointing to is something that's striking, though, is a lot of this is norms, not laws. And one thing we've been instructed by with Donald Trump is some of the things that we thought were kind of norms, some of the things we thought were laws are just norms. A current example is when you lose an election, you turn over power in such a way to help your successor succeed. You start in bringing them in through a transition. So I think you might see changes along that line where some of the norms invented by people like George Washington and John Adams. Maybe we need laws. So, for example, you could say that the day that Electoral College votes are certified or something, or the votes are certified at the Electoral College, then you must, under the law, initiate a transition to your successor. That's always been the norm, but Trump is violating the norm and causing trouble, I think, for the next administration.
And that would mean, like, the best way of looking at Trump then would be as like a stress test, as something that we went through and it helped us identify weaknesses in the system that we could tweak and reform and make stronger.
Again, very much like the election of 1800, another stress test where they realized, wow, we screwed it up in the Constitution because Aaron Burr was supposed to be running for vice president, but he gets as many Electoral College votes as Thomas Jefferson does. So Burr wants to see whether he can become president. The House of Representatives votes 35 times before, on the 36th vote, Thomas Jefferson finally is elected. Jefferson, by the way, comes in and does two impressive things in his inaugural. And Jefferson's another guy I think has had a very inflated reputation. But in his inaugural, Jefferson says, number one, not all opinions are matters of principle. That is, just because somebody disagrees with you doesn't mean they're a bad person. And the second thing he says is, I'm not going to throw the opposition newspaper editors into jail. I'm going to let the court of public opinion hear them. And if they're wrong, the court of public opinion will decide against them. And those are two norms that are established by Jefferson that this country has lived by more or less for 250 years.
I want to go back to Madison. You know, I know you note that he spent, I think it was 4 years studying the classical world, which is pretty amazing. And you talked about how, you know, the founders in general had thought that factions brought down the Roman Republic. And, you know, in Washington's farewell address, he warns against this. And you noted how Adams, his greatest mistake was made trying to avoid factionalism because he was afraid that that would bring down the country. Madison said no. And I guess my question is, what did Madison see that Adams and Washington didn't? Was it just the Articles of Confederation, or did he see something looking back at history that told him that maybe Washington and Adams had been misinterpreting what happened in Rome?
I think that's right. I think they kind of bought the myth, the legend. He's looking more at the hard-nosed reality of politics, both in his own time and in the ancient world. And he's saying, fellas, you just simply can't rely on public virtue, on people putting the common good before their own good. That's virtue is good to have, but it's not sufficient. You've got to have more. And so he kind of reverses the formula. Here again, I see an analogy between Washington and Madison. Washington has this great insight in the war. He learns how to fight differently than he'd gone into the war, and he adjusts to kind of a strategy of indirection of avoiding big battles. So he has the essential strategic insight during the war that allows him to win the war. And I think Madison has the essential strategic insight in the 1790s, along with some other people, that says, we're going to go in a different direction. We're going to have political parties. We're going to fight it out. And we're not going to say that's bad. We're going to say that's natural. This is the way things should be. And I think one reason he has this, and I think Hamilton to a degree has it, is they're both younger men than the revolutionary generation. And they both have kind of a national outlook. It's really striking to me that Madison, when he chooses to go to college, doesn't follow the pattern of the older generation. That is, Thomas Jefferson goes to college at Virginia, William and Mary. John Adams goes to college in Massachusetts at Harvard. Madison, a Virginian, instead of going to William and Mary, chooses Princeton, New Jersey, the College of New Jersey, which now is known as Princeton. And it's an interesting choice. First of all, he goes to what for him is the North. And the second thing is that Princeton is a heavily politicized college in the 1760s, kind of in the 1760s what University of California at Berkeley was 200 years later in the 1960s. One person wrote that Princeton smoked with sedition, that thought he was going to see a bunch of students studying to be ministers. Instead, they're all sitting around talking about politics. I think Madison chose Princeton for that purpose. The president of Princeton at the time was a Scottish man named John Weatherspoon, very unusual, first person brought from overseas to lead an American college. The only clergyman very involved in revolutionary politics, signs the Declaration of Independence. Uh, the only college president also involved in revolutionary politics. And one of the great things is we have the lectures that John Weatherspoon gave on politics and that Madison surely heard. And one of the things he does instruct Madison is checks and balances. How do you balance inside a government? This is coming very much out of Montesquieu, the French philosopher who was very influential on the Scottish Enlightenment. And John Weatherspoon comes out of the Scottish Enlightenment.
Yeah, it's amazing stuff, right? And you learn to accept human vices, and actually, like put them to work, to achieve virtuous ends. And it's interesting, right? So I think the biggest skill maybe that you could have right now, if you want to survive in this economy, is reinvention, and the ability to kind of reinvent and adapt. And it sounds like that's what Washington and Madison had, right? So Washington starts off trying to be like a conventional general, and he ends up adopting like asymmetric guerrilla warfare. And Madison starts off with these assumptions about governing, but through observation, is able to tweak them. He doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but he comes up with a way to achieve virtuous ends by like enlisting vice in the whole process.
And the amazing thing is that Madison's tinkering is so successful that we still live in the house he designed some 250 years ago. I think if you brought the founders back today, they would be so pleased at the resilience of their machine, this political machine they designed, and the fact that the republic, has lived for a couple hundred years. On the other hand, I think they would be shocked at the role that money plays in politics nowadays, and they would wag their fingers at us and say, you are in danger of losing this democracy we gave you because you're drifting towards oligarchy, again, ruled by the rich, that you've let the dollar become more important than the vote, and that's not what we intended.
One thing I found very interesting is it's not just America's governing philosophy that came from Rome and Greece and that the founders studied, but even the revolution itself. And, you talk about George Washington, employing this unconventional warfare against Great Britain. And part of that, I think he learned from the Native Americans during the French and Indian War, but some of that came from Fabius, right?
Yes, Fabius, the Roman general who is assigned to deal with Hannibal, the invader from Carthage. And Fabius recognizes that Hannibal is an extraordinarily adept general. He's tactically wonderful, and that the Romans again and again are getting beaten when they go into battle. And so he says, I'm not going to fight him. I'm going to have him chase me around. I'm going to wear him out, and I'm going to attack his supply lines and attack his political base of support. And that's very much what ultimately George Washington learns he has to do. And it is the best sign of a good general is the ability to change and adapt. In the middle of war, which is a very confusing, difficult enterprise in the first place, and Washington does change to his great credit and stops fighting a conventional fight and learns to use his militia. It's really striking in that first couple of years of the war. Washington says, I'm going to take New York, and he goes down to New York, and he first gets kicked out of Long Island, in the Battle of Long Island. Then he gets chased across Manhattan. Then he gets chased across New Jersey. And by the fall of 1776, he's beginning to think that I might lose this war. He writes privately to a relative who is very concerned about it. But he learns to change, and he learns to use the militiamen especially. At first, he thought these militias were kind of dirty, disrespectful, rude. They didn't show him the respect that a Virginia gentleman expected from farmers and tradesmen. And then he realizes, I need to use the militia for what they're good at. And they're not good at attacking British troops frontally in a war. The British troops will come back at us with a bayonet charge, and it's terrifying. But what they're good at is fighting around their homes and farms and fields and forests that they're familiar with. And if you use them that way, they can really nibble away at the British. And battles don't happen every day, but an army has to eat every day. And so in New Jersey, especially, when the British are sending out foraging parties or they have supply convoys coming through, the militiamen go out and attack them, they ambush them. And in the 6 months after Washington got kicked out of New York, they whittled down the British Army around New York from about 34,000 troops to about 16,000. And this is just through killing them, through wounding them, through encouraging deserters, through taking prisoners. And that is the road to success for Washington. He realizes all I have to do is keep this army alive, and eventually the British will give up. And that's the way he fights the war until finally at Yorktown, he has French money, French troops, and French ships protecting him and backing him up. And he's able to go back to a very conventional fight that is much more natural for him.
So did writing, I mean, obviously to write a book like this, you throw yourself into, events that happened hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago in the case of Greece and Rome. Did you find that to be psychologically beneficial as opposed to focusing on current events and Donald Trump?
Absolutely. I loved it. I basically spent 4 years in the basements of college libraries down where American history and ancient history was tucked away. And I found when I finished the book, and actually in this house I'm sitting in now, I kind of reemerged into the 21st century. And it was it was like coming out of a cave into the bright sunlight. And I was kind of blinking. I was actually much happier back in the 18th century than I have been in this year, this weird year of 2020.
I think we've touched a little bit on this, and there were areas where the founders sort of misinterpreted history or just even disagreed about history. But was there an area or areas where they just simply got history wrong?
Absolutely. Several places. I think they really were wrong on faction as what brought down the Roman Republic. More importantly, for our country, where they were terribly wrong with problems that resonate even down to us, is on slavery. They looked at ancient history and they said, well, Aristotle approves of slavery, so we must be okay. Well, the first thing is Aristotle did approve of slavery, but when he talked about people being better, he wasn't talking about ethnicity or race. He just thought that some people were superior to other people. And the important fact here is that ancient Greek and Roman slavery was not race-based, with the exception of Sparta, where it was ethnic. Also, ancient slavery, with the exception of Sparta again, was not as harsh as American race-based slavery. Ancient slaves had the right to petition the emperor if they felt they were being abused, and if they were freed, their children were able to hold public office. In America, except for the brief period after Reconstruction, you really didn't have Black people holding public office in this country until the late 1960s and the early 1970s, after Black people had been on this continent for centuries. So they really got slavery wrong in their understanding of ancient slavery. And I think partly because of that, they wrote slavery into the Constitution, into the fundamental law of the land. And as a friend of mine puts it, slavery is not a stain on the fabric of this country. It is part of the fabric of this country. It was woven in to the basic law of the land. And we are still trying to pull it back out of that weaving, pulling the yarns and strands out. And 250 years later, there are still people who in this country who are not persuaded that Black people are first-class citizens. And unfortunately, some of the people who believe that are wearing police uniforms.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've heard Christian pastors make this same point, because obviously people in the South were using the Bible to try to justify slavery, but they also made a similar. Well, I think it was a very convenient mistake that they made, right? But they were comparing, in a sense, apples and oranges, because the slavery that the Apostle Paul talked about wasn't the same as chattel slavery in America.
It was totally different in many aspects. And you wind up, I think the Supreme Court has made a lot of screaming mistakes in our history. One of the worst is the Dred Scott decision that states in the 19th century that Black people have no rights that white people are bound to respect. And that, with the Constitution, lights the fuse for the Civil War. And it's a problem. I think if the founders came back today, they would be embarrassed at how they managed to write slavery into the law and how it has lasted so long. To understand them, though, you got to remember that at the Constitutional Convention, two states, Georgia and South Carolina, said that if you have a whiff of getting rid of slavery in this Constitution, we will walk. We will not be part of the reconstituted United States. And that was important because these little states would need foreign help to defend themselves, probably. And so you'd wind up having the European powers of Spain, France, and England coming back into the continent and perhaps threatening this new United States.
And something I didn't know is that you write about how at the end of his life, George Washington was reading about abolition. That's an interesting point.
Well, Washington, again, I think, is an intellectually curious man, not well educated. In fact, John Adams and Thomas Pickering early on have an argument over a few drinks about whether Washington is actually illiterate.
Yeah.
Washington,
Did they say Hamilton did all the writing? Or
yeah, that's what Pickering says. I was with him, and all those letters that you thought Washington wrote to you, John Adams, when you were in Congress during the war, those were written by that kid, Alexander Hamilton. I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought here on.
Well, I interrupted you, so that's on me.
Put me back on where I was going to talk about the
Washington and abolition.
The interesting thing about Washington is, like a lot of bright people who are not well educated, he learns from experience, and I think much more than his more verbal, more educated peers. He has experiences, he reflects on them, and he learns and changes himself. You see this, I think, coming out of the French and Indian War. You see it especially in the Revolution, but I think you also see it with Washington and slavery. He looks slavery in the eye in a way that Thomas Jefferson never does. And he begins, Washington, at the end of his life, to think about abolition. What strikes me about Jefferson is the enormous hypocrisy. Of all the founders, it seems to me that he is the guy with the biggest gap between his words and his actions. He writes wonderfully about liberty. The Declaration of Independence is, even today, an inspiring document, with especially the first couple of paragraphs when it talks about all men being created equal. And that's an aspiration this country still tries to live up to. Not always succeeding, but we always are chasing that goal. Yet, for all these wonderful phrases about liberty, Jefferson spends his life living off the sweat of captive human beings he considers his property. I mean, one of the most repugnant things I think I've ever read is a comment that Jefferson makes in a letter that on his farm he grows enough food to feed all his animals, including the Negroes.
I want to bring it full circle. So you started off this journey the day that Donald Trump was elected president, and I think you very clearly demonstrated that the founders looked to antiquity and for crafting this nation, and that in so doing they created a pretty resilient system that was able to survive even the kind of authoritarian that they might have been afraid of. So that's obviously a takeaway. I think it's very clear that you believe, through our discussion, that you believe that we could reform and amend and tweak things, and that we ought to be doing that. But when you emerged from this, what other sort of insight or wisdom was gained for how this informs your perspective on our current politics?
I think one of the things I took away was that the period we're going through now is not an anomaly in American history. It is pretty predictable that we're going to have these ups and downs, and that we have when you design a system to be adversarial, you're going to have contention. When you design a system that relies on checks and balances, a check is a rough thing. In hockey, it's knocking someone backward hard. And a political check it can be pretty rough. Uh, it also makes me think we're not as bad off as we may think we are. I keep on hearing people talk about the disruptive effect of social media these days. I think that American political newspapers emerging in the 1790s were far more disruptive and far scarier to conservatives like John Adams than anything that's happening today with social media. I mean, uh, imagine if the president of the United States threw the top executives of Apple, Facebook, Google, and 10 other tech companies into jail. That's kind of where John Adams was in the 1790s.
Yeah, and if he had Twitter, he would have said some pretty crazy things too.
Oh yeah, I mean when you read John Adams like notes, like when one newspaper editor was burned in a house fire along with his entire family, John Adams chuckled about it and thought he got exactly what he deserved, him and his family.
Yeah.
You actually give me the idea. Somebody should do a John Adams Twitter account.
Well, you've succeeded in making me feel a little bit better about the state of things. Before I let you go, I have a question about your last book. You were on this podcast and you talked. Your last book was a great book. Also, it was about Orwell and Churchill and Orwell. And I read the book before I interviewed you. That was a couple years ago. And then this summer, I reread the book, and so I started off rereading it because I wanted to. I'm a columnist and I was looking for ideas. So I wanted to glean like what would, Orwell wrote about authoritarianism. Like what would Orwell have to say about today? But interestingly, as I read your book, instead of getting insight about Orwell taking on, Big Brother, what struck me is Orwell's struggle against his own team, Orwell's struggle against the left. And I had this interesting experience because I'm a conservative, but I'm a never Trump conservative. And I don't want to compare myself to Orwell, but I found some similarities between what he must have been going through by sort of taking on the people, all of his priors and his assumptions, and taking on his own team, and what never Trumpers are going through right now, being like politically homeless. And I just wondered if you had thought of that or if you had any insight into that.
I think it's a good analogy. You're right. I actually thought about this earlier today when I saw a reference to death threats that Republican officials who are saying there's no fraud in the election. They've been, I think it was in Georgia, death threats they've been getting. And I remember, the first people the communists go after is not the conservative, it's the socialist. And likewise, the hard right Trump people who believe that the election was stolen, the people they're going to go after are the never Trumpers and Republican state officials who won't go along with the party line. And the lesson there is, first of all, police your own side and support people who police their own sides, even if you don't agree with them ideologically. This came up for me because my legal residence is now in Texas, and my congressman is a right-wing nut named Chip Roy. Nonetheless, when Chip Roy declined to endorse this crazy Texas lawsuit, on Twitter, I said, not snarkily, thank you for doing this. It's nice to see somebody being ideologically consistent. He said, I won't join the lawsuit because I think it's a terrible abuse of what my party should believe in. You don't go asking the federal government to disenfranchise voters in millions of voters in states. So he showed some ideological consistency, which I think is good.
Yeah. And by the way, he was Ted Cruz's chief of staff. which is really interesting, right? Because Ted Cruz is wanting to argue before the Supreme Court on behalf of Trump. And so kudos to Chip Roy. I give him, props for that.
Yeah, it's the second time in the last couple of weeks I've agreed with Chip Roy, and I began to get worried.
Well, let me just thank you for coming on. You could probably tell I'm a fan. I'm a fan of you and what you do. And I'm excited about what your next book is going to be, because you've been hitting them out of the ballpark. Let me just recommend everybody this. There's still, I think, number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list this week.
Yeah.
Last week. Still time to get it for Christmas. So get it today. It's called First Principles: What America's Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans and How That Shaped Our Country. Thomas Ricks, thank you for coming back on the news.
You're welcome.
If you like this podcast, rate and review it on iTunes. Follow Matt on Twitter at Matt K. Lewis. Thank you for listening to Matt Lewis and the News.